Hey, what's up, friends? Thanks so much for joining us for this exciting first week in our new series, Foolproofing Your Life. Now, I know there's not a single one of us who wants to be a fool, but how do we foolproof our life? You're about to find out. So let's jump in. Well, it is official. It's summer season, which means it's also travel season, especially after last year, all that craziness and everything. And then as things are opening up this year, I think we all know there's going to be a lot more travel going on this summer. And I think, you tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we can all generally agree that nobody wants to look like a foreigner or a vacationer or an outsider when we're going places, right? Like, we never want to stand out as being like the really obvious outsider, foreigner, traveler, or whatever. But for a number of reasons, we want to know, what we're doing and where we're going and how to get there. And we probably also prefer if we can make sure that we look like we know what we're doing and where we're going and how to get there. Even if we don't actually know, we want to make sure we look like we do, right? Well, last year, in the middle of the pandemic, actually, my wife, Madeline, and I decided to travel into New York City to visit her sister who was living there. It was a strangely perfect time, actually, to see the city because there were so few people that were still in New York City. And for me, it was my first time, actually, believe it or not, first time ever going to New York City. At that point in my life, I hadn't been, and I was excited to go visit. And so we got on the Amtrak here in Fredericksburg, sat in the train, and then went all the way on the train to Penn Station. And that's where the real fun began to happen. You see, we got to Penn Station and we got on the phone with her sister to see where exactly she was because there was a little uncertainty. And she told me, because I was the one talking to her, she told me where we were supposed to go. She was like, you need to do this, Rockaway, and then blah, blah. I'm like, Rockaway, got it. So I look for a train that says it's going there, and Madeline and I, we get on the train. But we don't get going for very long, We're actually a little bit after a little while, I get on my phone and I'm going, this is seeming to take longer than I thought it was going to, because we're only talking about a couple blocks away. We were really only a few blocks away from where we were going to supposed to be end up at, But then after we're going for a while, I look at my phone and sure enough, we are already way off course. My friends, we got the whole way to flipping Long Island. That's where it took us. It took us all the way out to Long Island. And of course, at some point along the way, I'm asking one of the people who work there, I'm like, hey, this is our situation, blah, blah, blah. And they're like, so sorry, you're going to have to get off there and go all the way back. Long story short, we were obviously not sure where we were going. I looked like an idiot. And it took us an extra 3 hours, literally, to get to her apartment than it was supposed to take us. I wonder, have you ever been in a situation, maybe not that, like anything quite like that, but have you ever been in a situation where you were pretty concerned about looking like an idiot and you were really trying hard to not look like an idiot, not look like you didn't know what you were doing, not like look like a fool? I mean, I think we've all been there. We probably all would want generally to have our whole lives be one where it doesn't make us look stupid at all. One where we look like, and we really do have it all together. But the unfortunate thing for us is that just wanting to, I mean, we all want to, but just wanting to not look like a fool isn't enough to keep you from looking like a fool. In fact, we will sometimes do things, say things, believe things, or act in ways that we find to be totally right. That's why we're doing them. They seem wise to us, and yet they end up leading us to looking foolish. And that's whether we actually realize that we're playing the fool or not. Now, our aim in this series, just so you know, as the title indicates, is about foolproofing your life. And this is going to be a series, just so you know, it's for everyone, from every background. And that's what's cool about Proverbs from the Bible, is that most other ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature of that time was mostly only for, if you look at it, for the elite young men, specifically elite young men who who were being groomed for royal service. So the idea of a lot of the old ancient Near Eastern wisdom literature is, let's get these young guys to be trained to know how to be royalty, to know how to be kings or work in the royal courts and all that. And Proverbs, it's been said, I thought this was cool in my research, Proverbs is the representation of the democratization of wisdom. Basically, it's a lot of fancy words of saying Proverbs was written by Solomon, inspired by God, to go ahead and make wisdom available to everyone. Not just the elite, not just young men, but everyone would be able to have access to wisdom. There's nuggets that we're going to find in this 7-week series. There's nuggets that are specifically talking to men, to women, talking about young, talking about old, talking to the rich or the poor, and every other kind of division that we would think of. It's going to go ahead and include those in there and talk about wisdom for everybody. So it's all about giving us principles for godly living so that we don't end up looking like a fool. Foolproofing our life. That's the goal, right? And I want to take 7 weeks to focus on 7 of the most critical characteristics of a wise person. We're going to keep it real simple, and each week we're going to talk about just one of the critical characteristics of what a wise person is and how they operate, because I like keeping things simple. But generally, when I write a message, especially one that might be extra challenging, now I just let you know that it's an extra challenging message. Not sure if I wanted to show my hand like that, but I did. Anyway, I like to, when I do messages like that, I like to ask and then answer a pretty self-centered but still instinctive question that I think we often tend to have. And tell me if I'm wrong. The question of, what's in it for me? You know, what's in it for me? Why should I listen to what you have to say? What's in it for me? Well, what's interesting is that Solomon, the one who primarily is the author of, and he's the main contributor to the collection that is Proverbs, he knew that this was a good question to ask and a good question to answer. In fact, we don't get into the cute little proverbial sayings that we know Proverbs for until like chapter 10, because chapters 1 through 9 are mostly all about setting the tone for all of those little sayings. It's Solomon's way of laying out before the reader what they stand to gain in listening and learning from what he's got to say. Basically, he's going, okay, man, here's why you need to listen to me. Here's why this matters. I mean, just look at what he's talking about in the first 2 verses, in just verse 2 of this whole book. He starts off by saying, to know wisdom and instruction, to understand words of insight, to receive instruction in wise dealing, in righteousness, justice, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, knowledge and discretion to the youth. Let the wise hear and increase in learning, and the one who understands obtain guidance, to understand a proverb and a saying, the words of the wise and their riddles. Now, what's in it for me isn't the most healthy demand for us to make in life. I always be asking that question. But the first 9 chapters, if you read all 9 chapters of Proverbs, are answering that exact question. It's showing us the incentives for really listening in to the wisdom to come in the book. And I love that it's got a flavor of hope. I mean, he said in that, he said, let the wise hear and increase in learning. Now, no matter how wise we are, that means, or how wise we maybe think we are, there's always going to be an increase available. There's always going to be more wisdom that we can gain and learn and grow in. You can grow in wisdom, and God puts this in His Word so that you will. He wants that for you. And I also love that this wisdom is multifaceted. I mean, look at what he said in there. It's instruction in wise dealings. So this stuff will be practical. Increase in learning. Well, this stuff will be intellectual. Righteousness, justice, and equity. This stuff will be moral. To understand proverbs, words of the wise, and riddles. So this stuff will be insightful. If we're willing to listen in and learn, well, we're going to get a lot to learn. That's what I'm basically trying to tell you here at the beginning of this series. And this is ultimately God's invitation to His better way of life. And since wisdom equals the skill for godly living, that's kind of the definition that I'm going to use for this series. Wisdom is the skill for godly living. This is God's invitation then to sharpen your and my skills of life. He's inviting us on a journey of growth that is going to positively affect pretty much every part of our life. And it's going to positively affect it in big ways too. Now, if chapters 1 through 9 are an introduction of sorts, and it's pretty interesting then how the introduction seems to end. And it's totally connected to how I just said we're invited by God to be on a journey. See, Solomon gets to describing the path of foolishness and where it leads. And he says this about the fool on this path in verse 18 of chapter 9, there at the end of the introduction. But he does not know that the dead are there, talking about that path, that the dead are there, that her guests are in the depths of Sheol. Sheol, by the way, is the house of death in the Old Testament. So it's pretty serious stakes for that path of foolishness. There's like a lot to lose, death and the depths of Sheol and all that. But fortunately, it's not all doom and gloom here. A lot of Proverbs, as we're going to see in the weeks to come, are structured to offer a comparison of like two opposites. And check this one out in Proverbs 4, when he's again in the introduction trying to sell the reader on why they need to listen in. He says, "The path of the righteous is like the light of dawn, which shines brighter and brighter until full day. The way of the wicked is like deep darkness. They do not know over what they stumble." You know, just a couple weeks ago, Madeline and I, for our anniversary, we took a trip out to the Harrisonburg area. We went out into the mountains and all that, and I convinced her to go ahead and do a hike with me. We kind of planned it out. We did this great hike. We didn't realize, that's why I had to convince her. We didn't realize it was going to be a big hike up to this fire tower. But I told her the views were going to be worth it, so we got all dressed up and we went up there to do a photo shoot together, just her and I. And we discovered as we were going up, one, that it was a bit more of a hike than we thought we were going to be getting, but that it was pretty easy to hike up when the sun was still up. But hiking down, the sun had already set. We had already got those pictures at sunset. They were beautiful. And every minute, it just got darker and darker and darker. And I've done enough sunrise and sunset hikes to know this. In case you're not a hiker, let me just tell you what is very obvious once you think about it. Hiking at dusk, when the sun is setting, creates increasing uncertainty and unease. You can see less and less. You just don't know. You start hearing noises and you're like, oh, now I'm more concerned about the noises I'm hearing. And hiking at dawn creates increasing peace and enjoyment because you're starting to see more and more, and you're starting to get more of a sense of your bearings and all that. That's what Solomon's basically trying to get at in this parable, in this proverb rather. He's saying the reality is true. When you are walking in the paths of righteousness and the paths that God has for you, it becomes more and more enjoyable, more and more peaceful and creating ease and all that. And when you do it the opposite, when you start walking in foolishness, it becomes more and more uncertain, more and more dangerous, and more to your detriment. Now, every path has a starting point. So the question is, where do we begin? Now, I've got a good lead on an answer to that question of where do we begin, because in verse 10 of chapter 9, Solomon writes, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." So there you go. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Proverbs 14:27 says, "The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, that one may turn away from the snares of death." So those snares of foolishness that I was just talking about, leading to death and destruction, those traps and those snares, well, the fear of the Lord is the key to avoiding those. And it's also a fountain of life. So not just safety from bad, avoiding the bad stuff, it's also an invitation to good. Now, the fear of the Lord, just so you know, isn't about terror. Like, we hear the word fear and we're like, oh my gosh, like, be really afraid of God. Like, I'm supposed to be like, oh my gosh, I hope God doesn't strike me dead now. Like, every day you walk out your house, you're like, man, I just hope God doesn't kill me today. That's not what I'm talking about. The fear of the Lord is actually the invitation to the deepest, most profound respect for the person of God. That's what it really means. It's just a sense of utter respect and reverence for who God is. Now, let's pause for a second. This is something really unique and important about biblical wisdom, and especially the kind that we're going to see here in Proverbs over these 7 weeks. So I'm betting a lot of you know that wisdom is pretty well talked about in a lot of other Eastern religions, right? I mean, wisdom is celebrated. It's talked about. Their holy books will have wisdom in it. Some of them, it is. Just, that's what it is. Wisdom is all those religions seek after. But Christianity and our roots that include wisdom like Proverbs, offer a special clarification. This is really cool. Eastern religion often places high value on attaining wisdom and insight, but it is that wisdom and insight oftentimes the beginning and the end. Enlightenment. Just grow in wisdom and knowledge, and that is the beginning and the end, and that's it. See, God wants to make sure that we go beyond that to get what is even more important. God says wisdom begins with Him. So wisdom isn't the God we serve, but it helps us to better serve the God that we serve. And it's grounded in a deep respect and reverence for our God, our Creator, our Sustainer, and Redeemer. And wisdom doesn't just begin with Him, but this is what's cool, but it leads us closer to Him as well. It's not the end result. It is a tool that God uses to lead us, starting with Him, to deeper appreciation and deeper understanding of who He is. So I mentioned earlier that we're going to cover 7 critical characteristics of the foolproof person, right? That's what we're covering, 7 characteristics of the foolproof person. Well, today's characteristic is so deeply connected to that idea of the fear of the Lord that it just had to be the first one for us to discuss. And it's this: a wise person trusts in God. A wise person trusts in God. A foolproof person trusts in God. Look at what Proverbs 22:17-19 says. He says, "Incline your ear and hear the words of the wise, and apply your heart to my knowledge, for it will be pleasant," which is a nice thing, right? "If you keep them within you, if all of them are ready on your lips, that your trust may be in the Lord. I have made known them to you today, even to you." He's basically laying out all this wisdom I'm giving to you, all this stuff I'm writing down and all that. I just wanted to help you trust the Lord. Now, what's not as obvious in these verses, as it will be in the verses we're going to end with today, as we're spending our time together, is that trusting in God always requires a shifting of trust that we already have. Trusting in God, you might want to write it down if you're a note taker, just trust me, we'll get to it later on. Trusting in God always requires a shifting of trust that we already have. See, trusting is about leaning on something or someone. For instance, trusting a chair to hold me up, a stoplight to not all of a sudden decide that all lights are going to go green at the same time, trusting a parent to lead lovingly, or trusting a client of yours to show up on time for the meeting that you guys agreed to and with the necessary things they were supposed to bring to the meeting, right? We're in some way leaning on those different things in different ways. We're leaning on them, we're trusting them. But generally, when it comes to the core of our lives, we're naturally wanting to lean on ourselves, our insight, our understanding, our perspective. Just think about how we process things in life and how we talk about things. We'll say things like, "Well, that's not how I see it." We'll say things like, "That's not been my experience." Or, "That may be true for you, but not for me. That's not true for me." Or, we can get really nasty about it and be like, "You'd be an idiot to think that." And then they're like, "Well, why?" And you're like, "Because I think so." Like we think very highly of the way that we think. And to an extent, to survive in life, we had to, at a young age, begin making observations about the world around us, and from there then make some generalizations about the way the world works. Just think about it. We learned at an early age, crying will often equal attention. So, got it. I want attention. I'm going to cry. We didn't always figure out how to articulate what we wanted attention for, but parents, you know about that. Now, some kids shouting and pouting or pestering their parents equaled ultimately getting what they wanted. And some kids shouting and pouting and pestering their parents equaled getting a whooping. So we observed whatever we observed accordingly, and then made general rules from there. And we did that in all kinds of areas of our lives. You then made rules about friendships. You grew up and made observations and then made rules about dating. You made observations and then made some principles and proverbs about marriage, work, family, politics, and so on and so on and so on and so on. You may not ever be able to publish a book, and they certainly may not be as polished as the ones that we'll read this summer. But in your head, you have made some proverbs. You've made some wise things that make sense to you about the way things work in life. Some nuggets of wisdom you've cooked up for the way the world works because of how it's worked for you. But there's an ugly reality that as we mature, if we mature, we begin to realize. And it's this: I actually don't know a lot, right? Like, we eventually start to realize I actually don't know a lot, or at least I can't predict a lot of what will happen in my life. Interestingly enough, God most definitely recognizes this. And go figure, in Proverbs points it out so that we can grow in wisdom by saying in Proverbs 27, "Do not boast about tomorrow, for you do not know what a day may bring." We don't. We don't know what a day is going to bring. I mean, just this week alone, I got the tragic news of the passing of an old friend of mine. And then the next day, Madeline and I got asked to do an engagement shoot. Literally a couple hours later, can you guys do an engagement shoot? And I got to enjoy, honestly, one of the best sunsets I've ever seen in my life. And none of this was things that we, had on our schedule for the beginning of the week. When we talk about our schedule sometimes on Sundays, these weren't things we had planned. These weren't things that I knew was going to happen. None of it. I have no idea what tomorrow will bring. Wonderful or devastating. And you don't either. You have no idea. And I've been on this earth for so much time, only so much, maybe more than you, maybe less than you. And I've only read so many books to expand my insight. And that still leaves me pretty limited. Like, I just don't know. But where I'm limited, there is an unlimited wisdom that exists. And my limitedness meets that unlimitedness in these ways. Look at Proverbs 16:9. The heart of a man plans his way, but the Lord establishes his steps. Proverbs 19:21. Many are the plans in the mind of a man, but it is the purpose of the Lord that will stand. And then an interesting proverb to think about in light of all these other ones. Proverbs 16:33 says, the lot, because they would do, in that time, a lot of throwing lots, casting lots and all that. And it was this kind of like random rolling of the dice. The lot is cast into the lap, but its every decision is from the Lord. And what that proverb, what that nugget is getting at is this, and the rest of them also as well: nothing happens by accident. God is sovereign over it all. He knows it all. He sees it all. He's working good for those who love him and are called according to his purpose in it all. So when we talk about trusting in God, what we're really saying is a transferring of our leaning from our limited selves to the unlimitedness of God. It is the wisest way to see the reality around us, that I'm not in control. I can't predict every turn in my life. Therefore, my insight, my understanding, and my way of thinking shouldn't be my greatest trust. If there's something available to me that is greater, that sees much more, knows much more, and understands much more, that should be where it is. But that's tough. Because let's just be real for a second. We do this at Alive often. I'm happy to trust God when it lines up with what makes sense to me in my experience, based off of my wisdom. But that's not really trust at all. That's convenient agreement. Trust is when I've been conditioned to see things differently than God says, but I'm going to decide to go his way anyway. So my observations or my conditioning might kind of help say, you should do this, or this is the right way, or this is how things work. And yet I'm going to go God's way. I'm going to go that way actually instead. Proverbs 21:2 says, every way of a man is right in his own eyes, but the Lord weighs the heart. I mean, I can pretty up or argue in the court of law every preconceived notion that I have about life, about money, sex, justice, and dealing with people that I don't like and that annoy me. I can come up with my own wisdom about all of those things and can come up with a pretty good argument. I can defend my way of naturally thinking what I'm prone to want to trust in. And I'll come up looking right in my eyes in every way, every time. I can always defend it if that's what I want to do. And that's what we do, isn't it? Like we go ahead and say, this is why I think this or I think that. But wisdom from God, hear me out, is an invitation. Remember that, right? It's an invitation. An invitation to let God do what he already does. We just saw in the last proverb we read. Weigh the heart to know what's really there, and then guide our steps. Because back to that path idea, there's a proverb that was so dang good, it got repeated verbatim in two places, 14:12 and 16:25. It says, there is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way to death. See, oddly enough, sometimes when we experience tastes of death in our life, like maybe the death of a relationship or the death of a career that we had, the death of a job or the death of a dream that we had, whatever it is, when we experience those kinds of death in our life, because we thought we knew better than God, we can sometimes then look to the sovereignty of God and blame him. We can go all of a sudden like, you let this happen? Like we thought we knew better than God, so we didn't listen to God, but then we look at God and be like, you let this happen. But God already knew that it's just like us to sometimes ignore him, but then come back around to him and blame him. Because Proverbs 19:3 says, when a man's folly brings his way to ruin, his heart rages against the Lord. But my friend, you and I, we don't need to rage against the Lord. You don't need to make a well-beaten path to death in your life, in all these different areas of your life. You don't need to act the fool, look the fool, or even feel like a fool. You can be wise. You can grow in wisdom. You can experience greater amounts of life, greater amounts of freedom and joy in your life. Look at what wisdom we can gain from this one proverb in Proverbs 19, verse 16. It says, whoever keeps the commandment keeps his life. He who despises his ways will die. The commandment, the word of God. What does God say? That's where life is found. Now, there's this funny gal I found on Insta a little while back. I think it was a couple weeks ago. And I started watching her reels, and they were just cracking me up. Because she'll do these things where she plays out these different situations where it just classically ends with a person, whether it's a real biblical character or a personification of a lot of us and all that. And the person's looking at God who just told them something obviously important insight and all that. And then she goes, after a pause, she's like, I'm going to see for myself. I'm going to see for myself. And it's funny because it's sadly how I know I've been tempted to live my life in so many ways, right? And like you too, right? Like we sometimes do this thing to God. We're like, oh, I know you said that, but I'm going to see for myself. I'm going to see for myself. And then we can be tempted to despise God for telling us what to do. We already know. I don't need you to tell me what to do. I already know. We can get fooled into thinking we should just trust ourselves. But fooled is absolutely right. See, no matter how bad it gets or how counterintuitive his ways may seem to us, there's proof that God can be trusted. And here it is. Proof is Jesus. See, Jesus was and is God's perfect Son. He never sinned or even led someone else to sin. And yet there's this crazy moment in his life where he knows that he's about to begin the swift journey to the cross. And so he's in the Garden of Gethsemane and he's praying fervently and he's asking God if there's any other way forward other than the cross, other than dying, other than suffering and all that. But then he relinquishes his trust. He leans deeply on God and his fear of the Lord and says, not, I'm going to see for myself. Instead, basically he says, I'm trusting your lead, God. I'm going to do what you say. I'm going to put my trust in you. And where does that lead him? To an unjust trial, unfair accusations, smacked, being whipped, being stripped, being shamed, being nailed to a cross, and then hung to die in front of his family and only one follower who was bold or crazy enough, who knows, to come to his final moments there at the cross. Now, I know, and we're going to talk about this in the series, I know Proverbs can't be treated like promises. They're not the same. But man, did trusting in God's ways seem to have backfired on Jesus big time here. Trust God and it'll go well for you, right? Like he'll order your steps and all. Psst. This seemed to backfire big time. But did it? See, that's the thing about trusting God and us determining whether it's working or not. See, we start to pack up and start calculating the final score before the game's even over. You want to say, sometimes, I'm done. I've tried dating God's way and it just didn't work. I'm going to lean back on my wisdom. Or we start to say things like, I'm out of this marriage. I tried doing what God says, but it's just never going to work. Back to my wisdom. Or I know I should be honest with my work, but last time I did that, I lost the promotion. So I'm going to go back to my wisdom, what makes sense to me. Whatever it is, we figure that we, in our limited understanding that we're back to leaning on again, we see it all. But God knew on that Friday with Jesus that Sunday was still coming. He knew. He ordered those steps. He was in that moment exposing and crushing the folly of the enemies of Jesus. And I just want to tell some of you listening right now that you've got to stop determining if God was and is worth trusting based off your Fridays when you haven't yet even seen, because you haven't waited yet to see what Sunday is going to bring. Jesus is proof that even in worst case scenarios, God can be trusted. And that's why Solomon famously said in the verse that I told you I was going to get to, I alluded to earlier, in Proverbs 3, 5 through 8, he says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. See, that's what I said. Earlier I said there's going to be this trade-off. It says in the later verse. Well, this is the later verse. You either trust in the Lord or you lean on your own understanding. And he invites us, in all your ways, acknowledge him. See God in them. Look for God in them. Listen to the wisdom of God in them. What's the path, God? Where am I supposed to walk? What does it look like to fear you in this moment, trust you in this moment, acknowledge you here? And then he'll make straight your paths. Be not wise in your own eyes. Fear the Lord. There's that again. And turn away from evil. It will be healing to your flesh and refreshment to your bones. Some of us watching today, y'all need some healing from some foolish things that you've done. You need some refreshment to the bones that are the very structure of your life. Or some of us, we just need to know that's an invitation that God invites us. We maybe haven't hurt yet that bad, but we don't want to. And God's saying, I've got some healing and some nourishment that's available to you. How does that happen? It said, stop being wise in our own eyes. That's too easy and not often all that accurate, right? Being wise in our own eyes. It's really easy to do and it's not often that accurate. Instead, he invites us, fear the Lord, revere him, and put pleasing him at the absolute top of the list of things that you're going to do. I'm going to please God. That's what I'm going to go after. That's my main aim. And also after what pleases God. And what pleases God? It honestly makes sense when you think about it. Trusting him. It pleases God when you trust him, when I trust him. The journey of trusting God and following his ways, I got to tell you, isn't going to always be easy. And the next 7 weeks are actually going to challenge each of us in ways that we're not always going to be comfortable with. So that's just my warning to you right now. It's my fair warning to you guys. There's going to be some moments where it's going to be uncomfortable or not easy for us. But it is ultimately a path to life, no matter what Friday says. It's a path to life. God can be trusted. Wait till Sunday comes. Don't worry. So I want to challenge you over these next 7 weeks to do this one thing. Walk more wisely. Just let's look at our path. Let's look at our feet. Let's look at our hearts and our minds, and let's walk more wisely. Figure out, and this is what it looks. This is how you do it. Figure out what wisdom is, what real wisdom is, and what it looks like to walk in it, and then make the choice that you will do that. And today, we see that wisdom is choosing to trust Jesus. So, let me ask you, what path are you going to take? Don't forget that today is the family reunion, and so want to make sure that you know that you're still welcome to come, whether you've RSVP'd or not. We want you to be there. We have a window from 3 o'clock to 7 o'clock that we've rented the pavilion at Old Mill right by the playground, and we'd love for you and your friends and family or whomever to join us. Anyone and everyone can come. We're going to have a party. We're going to have burgers and dogs, and you can bring a side if you're able to, because we're doing a potluck thing. We'll have drinks and all that kind of stuff. It'll be a great big party with some cornhole. We're gonna have fun. So if you miss this, you're really gonna miss out. So don't miss it. Be there this afternoon, and I look forward to seeing you and reconnecting as a church family together.